At 65, you expect to retire with dignity, not to be thrown into the freezing streets by your own flesh and blood. When a multi-million-dollar empire was handed entirely to his ruthless younger brother, Arthur was left with a single insulting inheritance, a broken, rotting grandfather clock. But the ultimate revenge was ticking quietly just beneath the splintered wood. The rain in Greenwich, Connecticut didn't fall. It drove hard against the stained glass windows of the Pendleton estate, mirroring the cold, fractured reality of the family gathering inside. Arthur Pendleton stood near the heavy mahogany doors of his father's study, his 65-year-old frame aching with a fatigue that went far deeper than his bones. For the past 15 years, Arthur had been a ghost in his own life. While his younger brother Richard was off in London, closing hostile takeovers and buying yachts, Arthur had remained at the estate, serving as the sole caretaker for their tyrannical declining father, Archibald Pendleton. Archibald had been a titan of East Coast manufacturing, a man made of iron and unyielding expectations. He was not a man who inspired love, but Arthur, driven by a desperate lifelong need for his father's approval, had sacrificed everything for him. Arthur's own marriage had crumbled under the weight of his father's demands. His career as a modest architect had been abandoned to manage Archibald's round-the-clock medical care, his volatile moods, and the massive, sprawling estate. Now Archibald was dead, and the reading of the will had drawn Richard back across the Atlantic. Richard sat in the center of the room, impeccably dressed, in a bespoke charcoal suit, his posture exuding the casual arrogance of a man who already knew he had won. Beside him sat Theodore Carmichael, the family's long-time estate lawyer, adjusting his tortoise-shell glasses with a trembling hand. Theodore had known the brothers since they were boys, and today he refused to meet Arthur's eye. "Let us proceed," Theodore said, his voice dry and devoid of its usual warmth. He broke the heavy wax seal on the final testament of Archibald Pendleton. Arthur held his breath. He didn't want the yachts or the overseas accounts. He only wanted the family home, the estate he had maintained with his own hands, and enough of a stipend to finally live out his twilight years in peace. He was 65, with no savings, having poured his own meager funds into the estate's upkeep, when Archibald's paranoia had caused him to freeze his own bank accounts. Theodore cleared his throat and began to read. "I, Archibald Winston Pendleton, being of sound mind, do hereby dictate the final distribution of my earthly assets. To my youngest son, Richard, whose killer instinct and business acumen mirror my own, I leave the entirety of Pendleton Manufacturing, the liquid assets held in the Cayman and Swiss accounts, and the Greenwich estate, provided he continues to expand the empire." The words hit Arthur like a physical blow to the chest. The room began to spin. Everything, he gripped the back of a leather armchair to steady himself. "Ted!" Arthur interrupted, his voice cracking. "There must be a mistake. Dad and we talked about this. He promised me the house. I gave up my life for him." Richard let out a low, patronizing chuckle. "Arthur, please, don't embarrass yourself. Father respected strength. You were a glorified nursemaid. Did you honestly think he would hand over a $40 million legacy to a man who spent the last decade trimming rose bushes and measuring out blood pressure medication? Read the rest, Theodore." Arthur demanded, his knuckles turning white. Theodore swallowed hard, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "There is one specific provision for you, Arthur. It reads, 'To my eldest son, Arthur. You have always possessed a sentimental heart, valuing time and memory over ambition. Therefore I leave you the 18th century French provincial long case clock that sits in the west hallway. May it remind you that time waits for no man, and you have wasted yours.'" Silence fell over the study heavy and suffocating. The cruelty of the bequest was staggering. It wasn't just a disinheritance. It was a final, calculated insult from the grave. "A clock," Arthur whispered. A broken clock. The grandfather clock in question had stood in the dusty, neglected West Wing for as long as Arthur could remember. Its brass weights were oxidized, its intricate wooden casing was chipped and rotting at the base, and its pendulum hadn't swung since the Reagan administration. It was a piece of junk that Archibald had refused to throw out purely out of stubbornness. "Well," Richard said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket, "that settles it. I'll be listing the estate with a broker by Monday. I expect you to have your things and your antique cleared out by the weekend, Arthur. I'll have security escort you out if you overstay." In the span of 10 minutes, Arthur had lost his home, his father, and his future. He walked out of the study, the sound of the driving rain masking the tears of profound betrayal that finally spilled down his weathered face. He was 65, completely broke, and utterly alone. Moving day was a masterclass in humiliation. Arthur had managed to secure a cramped first-floor one-bedroom apartment in a rundown neighborhood in Stamford. The rent was exorbitant for his non-existent income, requiring him to drain the last few $100s from his checking account just to secure the deposit. He had to beg 2 local handymen to help him transport his sole inheritance. The massive 8-foot-tall wooden clock barely fit through the door of his new apartment. When they finally wrestled it into the corner of the small living room, it leaned slightly to the left, dominating the space like a rotting wooden coffin. "That'll be $80, old man," one of the movers grunted, wiping sweat from his forehead. Arthur handed over the crumpled bills, his hands shaking. As the door clicked shut, he collapsed onto his cheap second-hand sofa and stared at the clock. The faded painted face of the moon dial seemed to sneer at him. It smelled faintly of decaying wood dust and old wax. It was a monument to his failure, a physical manifestation of his father's final cruel joke. The following weeks were a brutal awakening. At 65, entering the job market was a nightmare. Arthur's architectural license had expired a decade ago, and his recent resume consisted entirely of unpaid caregiving. He faced a wall of polite rejections from corporate firms and retail stores alike. He survived on cheap canned soup and bread, watching his bank balance dwindle to the single digits. Desperation set in. The rent was due in 3 days, and Arthur had $32 to his name. His eyes kept wandering back to the grandfather clock. It was ugly, and it was broken, but it was supposedly an 18th century antique. Perhaps it was worth something. Even a few $100s would buy him another month to find a job. Arthur found a local antique dealer online, a man named Simon Abernathy, who specialized in European estates. Simon arrived at the apartment the next afternoon, a sharp-eyed man carrying a jeweler's loupe and a clipboard. Simon spent barely 5 minutes examining the piece. He ran a finger along the chipped veneer, opened the glass door to inspect the rusted gears, and sighed. "Mr. Pendleton, I don't know how to tell you this gently." Simon began packing away his loupe. "This isn't an 18th century masterpiece. It's a late 19th century reproduction, and a poor one at that. The escapement mechanism is completely destroyed. The wood in the base has extensive dry rot, and the brass is cheap alloy. It would cost more to restore it than it would ever be worth on the market." Arthur's heart plummeted. "Nothing. It's worth nothing. I could give you $50 for the glass panels, maybe another $50 for the brass weights to sell as scrap. $100 total. And I'd be doing you a favor, honestly, because hauling this monstrosity to the dump will cost me gas. $100. It wouldn't even cover a fraction of his rent." It was the final straw. "Get out!" Arthur said, his voice trembling with a suppressed volcanic rage. "Excuse me." Simon blinked, taken aback. I said get out. Arthur roared the years of subservience, the betrayal and the sheer terror of his impending homelessness, finally snapping something inside him. Simon practically ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. Arthur was left alone in the stifling silence of the room. He turned to the clock. It stood there, silent, useless, a towering effigy of his father's disdain. "You ruined my life," Arthur screamed at the wooden casing. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy brass-handled fire poker he had picked up at a thrift store, and swung it with all the strength his aging body could muster. Crack! The poker smashed into the side of the clock. The cheap wood splintered instantly. "You took everything from me," he sobbed, swinging again. Crash! The glass door shattered, sending jagged shards across the cheap linoleum floor. The heavy brass weights broke free from their rotted gut lines, crashing down into the base of the clock with a deafening thud. Arthur dropped the poker, his chest heaving, tears streaming down his face. He sank to his knees amidst the glass and splintered wood, burying his face in his hands. He was broken, completely and utterly broken. But as the dust settled in the small apartment, Arthur heard a strange sound. It wasn't the ticking of gears. It was a slow, agonizing creak. The impact of the heavy brass weights dropping into the rotted base had dislodged something. Arthur looked up, wiping his eyes. The bottom front panel of the clock, the plinth, had cracked completely down the middle. But the wood hadn't just broken. It had sprung forward, revealing a sharp, unnatural, geometric shadow. Frowning, Arthur crawled closer, ignoring the glass crunching beneath his knees. He gripped the splintered edges of the bottom panel and pulled. With a loud snap of hidden rusted hinges, the false front of the clock's base tore away. Arthur gasped. There, wedged tightly into a cavity that had been invisible from the outside, was a dull, heavy steel lockbox. It was wrapped in heavy-duty plastic to protect it from moisture, and it was locked with a sophisticated biometric and keypad locking mechanism that looked wildly out of place inside a rotting antique. Trembling, Arthur reached into the cavity and pulled the heavy box out onto the floor. Attached to the handle by a zip tie was a thick, cream-colored envelope. On the front, written in the unmistakable sharp, aggressive handwriting of Archibald Pendleton, were 3 words to my caretaker. Arthur's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the heavy cream-colored envelope. The handwriting was undeniably Archibald's, sharp, aggressive. The ink pressed so hard into the paper, it left physical indentations. For a long moment, Arthur just stared at it, the shattered glass of the clock crunching beneath his knees. He wiped a mixture of sweat and tears from his face, took a deep breath, and tore the seal. Inside was a single, heavy sheet of personalized stationery. "Arthur, if you are reading this, it means one of 2 things. Either my grotesque clock finally rotted away and collapsed, or you finally found your spine, lost your temper, and smashed the damn thing to pieces. Knowing your endless capacity for suffering, I pray it was the latter. You have spent your entire life seeking my approval, Arthur. It was pathetic, but it was also entirely genuine. You possessed a sentimental heart, a tragic flaw in the world of business, which is why I could never hand you the reins of Pendleton Manufacturing. You would have been eaten alive by the board, and certainly by your brother. Richard is a shark. He possesses my ruthlessness, my drive, and my complete lack of empathy. But he lacks my discipline. I have watched him for years, siphoning funds, cutting corners, and making illegal offshore deals to fund his extravagant lifestyle. He thinks I didn't know, but I built that empire. I know every shadow in it. I left Richard the company because it is a sinking ship. The SEC has been quietly building a case against his London shell corporations for 18 months. I left him the estate because the property taxes and hidden debts attached to it will bleed him dry once his assets are frozen. I gave him exactly what he wanted, the crown. He will not realize until it is too late that it is lined with poison. But you, Arthur, you sacrificed your life to wipe my chin and listen to my shouting. You endured. Therefore you are the only one I trust with my true legacy. The keypad on the lockbox requires a 6-digit code. Think back to the only time in your miserable life you ever truly stood up to me. The day you physically blocked the bulldozers from tearing down your mother's greenhouse in the East Garden. You looked me in the eye and told me to go to hell. It was the proudest I have ever been of you. Take what is inside. Disappear. And do not look back. Archibald Arthur let the letter slip from his fingers. His breath hitched in his throat. His father hadn't abandoned him. In his own twisted Machiavellian way, Archibald had orchestrated a final sweeping act of protection for his eldest son, while simultaneously laying a devastating trap for his youngest. Arthur turned his attention to the steel lockbox. The biometric thumbprint scanner was disabled, leaving only the glowing red numbers of the digital keypad. The day he stood up to him. Arthur closed his eyes, the memory rushing back with vivid clarity. He was 32. His mother had passed away the year before, and Archibald, in a fit of grief-stricken rage, had ordered her beloved glass conservatory to be demolished. Arthur had stood in front of the heavy machinery in the pouring rain, refusing to move for 12 hours until Archibald finally called off the demolition crew. It was October 12th, 1993. With a trembling index finger, Arthur typed the numbers into the glowing keypad. 101293. The box emitted a soft electronic chime, and the heavy steel locking mechanisms retracted with a loud clack. Arthur pushed the lid open. Inside the box was lined with black velvet. Resting on top was a sleek, encrypted flash drive. Beneath that lay a thick leather folio, stamped with the gilded crest of Lombard Odier, one of the oldest and most exclusive private wealth banks in Geneva, Switzerland. Arthur opened the folio. It contained a masterfully executed irrevocable trust document. The beneficiary was listed simply as Arthur Winston Pendleton. The assets were fully liquidated, completely untraceable, and legally shielded from any corporate bankruptcy or estate clawbacks. Attached to the trust was a certified summary of the account's current holding. Arthur's eyes scanned down to the bottom line, and the breath was instantly knocked from his lungs. Total asset value, $5,250,000. Over $5 million. It was sitting right there, secured in a private banking account, waiting only for his signature and the cryptographic keys provided in the folio. Arthur let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He fell back onto his worn second-hand sofa, looking from the shattered wooden remains of the grandfather clock to the $5 million fortune resting on his lap. He was not broke. He was a multimillionaire. The transformation of Arthur Pendleton didn't happen overnight, but the shift in his internal gravity was immediate and profound. The crushing, suffocating weight of despair that had hunched his shoulders for a decade vanished, replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence. For the first time in 65 years, Arthur was not a servant to his father's demands or a victim of his brother's cruelty. He was a man with a future. His first move was a train ride into Manhattan. Dressed in his best, albeit slightly moth-eaten tweed suit, Arthur walked into the towering glass and steel headquarters of a partner firm associated with Lombard Odier on Madison Avenue. The lobby was a cathedral of imported Italian marble and hushed conversations. He was escorted by a sleekly dressed assistant into the private corner office of William Prescott, a senior wealth manager whose clientele consisted exclusively of ultra-high net worth individuals. Prescott, a sharp-featured man with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a bespoke navy suit, initially looked at Arthur with mild, polite skepticism. Arthur's frayed cuffs and scuffed loafers did not fit the profile of a man who belonged on this floor. "Mr. Pendleton, what can I do for you today?" Prescott asked, steepling his fingers. Arthur did not speak. He simply slid the heavy leather folio and the cryptographic keys across the polished expanse of the mahogany desk. Prescott opened the folio. As his eyes scanned the embossed seals and the certified account summaries, his entire demeanor shifted. The polite skepticism evaporated, replaced by an expression of profound, guarded deference. He sat up straighter, adjusting his posture to match the gravity of the documents before him. "Mr. Pendleton," Prescott said, his voice dropping an octave, "we have been monitoring this trust for quite some time. Your father was a remarkably cautious man. I can confirm these funds are entirely clean-free of any estate tax burdens, and most importantly, legally structured to be completely inaccessible to anyone but you. The corporate entities your brother controls cannot touch a single cent. How would you like to proceed with the transfer?" Within 48 hours, Arthur's life was quietly and entirely secured. He paid off his Stamford lease, in full handing the landlord a cashier's check without a word. He rented a luxury suite in a quiet, understated boutique hotel overlooking Central Park, allowing himself the simple luxury of a hot bath and room service while he plotted his next move. He began shopping for a permanent home, eventually settling on a beautiful, painstakingly restored 1920s craftsman house in the Hudson Valley, miles away from the toxic, suffocating atmosphere of Greenwich and the lingering ghost of his father's estate. But as Arthur settled into the quiet comfort of his new life, there was still one lingering piece of the puzzle left to address the encrypted flash drive. Sitting in the sunlit study of his new home, Arthur plugged the drive into a newly purchased laptop. The contents were a meticulously documented, horrifyingly thorough roadmap of Richard's criminal corporate activities. Archibald had spared no expense, hiring elite forensic accountants and private investigators to track Richard's every illicit move. Arthur clicked through the folders. There were wire transfer receipts to shell companies in Cyprus, encrypted emails proving the deliberate defrauding of minority shareholders, and forged environmental compliance reports that had saved the company millions while poisoning local waterways. It was an ironclad, undeniable case. It was enough to put Richard in federal prison for a very long time. For an hour, Arthur just stared at the glowing screen. The power to destroy his brother rested under his right index finger. He could easily format the drive, toss it into the fireplace, and walk away. He could take his $5 million and let his brother figure out his own mess. He was, after all, a peaceful man. But then the memory surfaced. He remembered the cold, mocking laugh in their father's study. He remembered the driving rain, the threat of being dragged out by security guards, and the absolute, chilling disregard for his humanity. Richard hadn't just taken the company. He had tried to erase Arthur's entire existence. Arthur didn't send the files to Richard. He didn't demand a tearful apology or try to negotiate a truce. Instead, utilizing an encrypted email service, he anonymously forwarded the entire unredacted contents of the flash drive to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS, and the investigative desk of the Wall Street Journal. The fallout was catastrophic, spectacular, and instantaneous. 2 weeks later, Arthur was sitting on the wraparound porch of his Hudson Valley home, sipping a cup of expensive loose-leaf Darjeeling tea. The morning air was crisp, and the surrounding woods were alive with the sounds of autumn. His phone, resting on the wrought-iron patio table, began to vibrate. It was an unknown number. Arthur took a slow, deliberate sip of his tea and answered. Arthur. It was Richard, but the voice was completely unrecognizable. It wasn't the slick, commanding baritone of a corporate titan. It was the ragged, high-pitched, breathless wheeze of a cornered animal. "Good morning, Richard," Arthur said calmly. "The feds raided the Greenwich estate this morning." Richard stammered, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "They kicked the doors in at dawn, Arthur. They froze the company accounts. They froze my personal accounts. Everything is gone. The stock plummeted 70% at the opening bell. They are talking about federal indictments." "I read about the investigation in the Journal yesterday," Arthur replied mildly, watching a squirrel dart across his lawn. "A terrible tragedy for the shareholders." "Arthur, listen to me. You have to listen." Richard pleaded, a frantic edge of sheer hysteria bleeding into his words. "I was tearing the study apart looking for cash, and I found Dad's private handwritten ledger hidden behind a false panel in his safe. The feds didn't look closely at it, but I did. He wrote something about a contingency fund, a Lombard Odier trust in Geneva. Over $5 million. Arthur, is that so?" "Yes, and the ledger. It referenced the provenance documents of that antique clock. The one he gave you. The rotting long case clock, Arthur, the account numbers, must be hidden inside the casing. I need that clock right now. I need that money to pay for a top-tier defense attorney, or they are going to lock me in a federal penitentiary for 20 years. Arthur leaned back in his wooden rocking chair. The poetic justice was so perfect, so beautifully constructed by their late father, from beyond the grave that Arthur almost felt compelled to applaud. Archibald had given Richard the rope, and Richard had eagerly hung himself with it. "I don't have the clock any more, Richard," Arthur said, his voice smooth and steady as glass. "What do you mean you don't have it?" Richard screamed, the sound distorting the phone's speaker. "Where is it? Did you sell it?" "I'm afraid it met with an accident. The wood was terribly rotted. It just fell apart." "Arthur, you idiot. The documents, the money." "Oh, the documents." Arthur said, a slow, deep smile spreading across his weathered face. "Yes, I did find a rather heavy steel lockbox hidden in the base when it shattered into pieces." Dead silence fell over the line, broken only by Richard's ragged, shallow breathing. You opened it," Richard whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "I did. And I must say, William Prescott over at the private bank has been exceptionally helpful in securing the funds. Very professional firm. Arthur, you have to give that to me," Richard demanded, his voice dropping from panic to a menacing, desperate growl. "That is my inheritance." He meant that for the company. He meant it to save the empire from exactly this kind of disaster. "No, Richard," Arthur said firmly, the decades of subservience finally melting away into absolute steel. He meant it for the son who stayed. He left you the empire because he knew exactly what you were doing to it. He left you the ship because he knew you had spent the last 5 years drilling holes in the hull. You got exactly what you deserved. "I will sue you," Richard shrieked, his composure completely shattering. "I will drag you into court. I will destroy you." "With what money, Richard?" Arthur interrupted softly, his tone almost pitying. "Your accounts are frozen. Your lawyers are abandoning you. You have absolutely nothing. And I have $5 million and a very, very quiet life." Arthur didn't wait for a response. He pressed the red button on his phone, severing the connection forever, and then permanently blocked the number. He stood up, leaving his tea on the table, and walked back into the warm, sunlit living room of his new home. In the corner, ticking with a steady, rhythmic, comforting heartbeat, stood a magnificent, fully restored 18th-century French provincial long-case clock. Arthur had bought it at an exclusive Manhattan auction the week before. It was a flawless piece, its brass weights polished to a mirror, shine its intricate gears turning in perfect, unending harmony. Arthur walked over and gently ran his hand along the polished cherrywood casing. For his entire life, he had felt like time was slipping away from him, stolen by duty fear and the demands of cruel men. But as he listened to the steady tick of the pendulum, he smiled. Time, he realized, was no longer his enemy. It was finally his own. Are you shocked by Archibald's ruthless final test? Did Arthur do the right thing by keeping the $5 million and letting his greedy brother face the consequences, or should family always stick together no matter what? Let us know what you would have done in the comments below. If you loved this story of ultimate revenge and hidden treasure, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more incredible real-life dramas.